partly because of social media, partly because communication is so fast, partly because families are so scattered now over such large parts of the country, that social change, when it comes, tends to come more or less at the same time.
You're a very busy man in community, and you obviously have a sense of purpose. You're a man of faith, and you're happy to talk about what you see and discuss it, and as is the very best way to share in conversation and maybe find the path ahead. Well, Charles, welcome to Peckham Podcast.
Yeah, thank you. Very good. Very good to be here. Thank you for asking me.
Just do it. I say in Peckham Podcast, it's where big ideas find local traction. And I use that phrase because sometimes there are big ideas that don't specifically emerge from a community, but relate in important ways to any community. And so on that basis, I like to keep a wide view of the world, even though the majority of our editions in Peckham Podcast are locally focused with local people. I was interested to catch from you a worldview, if you like, through your communities in the north of England. So first of all, tell us where you are. Okay,
so I'm in Halifax in West Yorkshire. A smallish, about 100,000 people altogether. The part where I live is actually called a valley. So Calder Valley and Halifax taken together are two constituencies. The economy at one time predominantly would have been mills. There are lots of old mill buildings around here. So we're talking about woolen mills, all sorts of mills. In fact, the largest carpet mill in Europe, if not the world, was based at Dean Clough, which is actually in the town of Halifax itself. My wife is from Halifax, born and bred, and her family have lived here for several generations. It's very much a West Yorkshire industrial town, which grew relatively wealthy on the basis of the woolen trade, textiles mainly, some engineering, that kind of thing. There's still quite a lot of manufacturing in the Calder Valley and Halifax. It's, I would say, still a pretty traditional community in most respects. In fact, I would go so far as to say that you have several fairly traditional communities living side by side now as a result of immigration. But generally speaking, I would say that a lot of the Halifax traditions remain pretty much as they have been for many generations. But of course, there are signs of change inevitably. Population is much more mobile. There's more churn, so people tend to change. Probably the communities are starting to break up now.
Now, in London, we're living in a world of quite intense diversity. It's said, as you possibly know, that London registers about 1/3 British white now in the capital. What have you seen over your lifetime in the north of England, in your own town?
So as a student teacher in the late 1970s, I visited primary schools in places like Batley and Dewsbury, which were already 100% Muslim of Pakistani heritage. The same by that point would have been true of quite a number of primary schools in Bradford. And of course, those changes have been coming in really since the 1960s, so that they'd had time to bed in. What I would say that the main change that we've seen is that obviously the migrant communities have grown and inevitably are spreading out. It would probably still be true to say that there's less mixing of communities of the kind that you probably see in London. I mean, to what extent communities really do mix in London is possibly a moot point. But I would say that there's probably more mixing of communities now than there was, but it's still possible. I mean, again, I suspect, unlike London, it's still possible to live in an area which is overwhelmingly white or overwhelmingly Muslim of Pakistani heritage, or even areas that are entirely white or entirely Muslim of Pakistani heritage. You know, I suppose the differences are quite stark. Other changes, I suppose, in a way, that the social changes that we've seen here are a late reflection of the kind of social changes that were already underway in London when I was growing up there. So the traditional family structure, for example, certainly among the majority white population, is largely broken down. Not among all communities, but to quite a large extent, causing quite a number of problems in itself. Obviously, changes in social attitudes on things like marriage and when to have children and that kind of thing. So the position of women, I would think, is very different now in the north of England from what it would have been 50 years ago. But that's generally true of society. So, I mean, a lot of the changes that are taking place here are local reflections of wider and broader changes. One of the biggest changes would be due to migration and its consequences, particularly over the last 30, 40 years. And the other big change would be in terms of populations being far more mobile, in part because, of course, the traditional industries that I mentioned earlier have gone. I mean, there are still a few textile businesses going, but those big mills which employed thousands of people, of course, they went 30 or 40 years ago, or were on their way out. And of course, they were a main reason, a bit like the mines in other parts, coal mines in other parts of West Yorkshire. Communities, obviously, because there was work there, communities tended to cluster around those mills, around those mines. They've gone. Consequently, the communities themselves, in search of work, in part, are much more mobile, much more split up. And for many people, there's much less security of employment than would have been enjoyed by their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents.
You mentioned a few moments ago about the position of women being now different from, say, 50 years ago. What were you thinking of when you said that?
I don't think it's just the north of England, but it would have been normal for many women when they got married to stop work. So if I think of my wife's parents' generation, when the women married and started families, they tended to stop work. Some carried on, but by and large they would stop work. That's much less the case now. I think people, I think this is general, isn't it, across the country, that people take it for granted that they will go out to work, they will pursue a career, etc. It's noticeable, for example. I mean, I've got a history of one of our local primary schools here. So been involved in education. I'm still a primary school governor. But if you look at photographs of the school staff from, say, the 1950s, 1960s, a good chunk of the staff, if not the majority, and certainly most, if not all, of the senior staff were men. Now, if I look at for example, and the primary school where I'm a governor would be an example, there is one man on the staff, and he's part-time. It's not a big school, so we're talking about 15 staff or so. But all women, including all the senior staff. So the head, deputy, 2 assistant heads. So that I mean, again, that's not a change. It's peculiar to this part of the world. But my impression, as somebody who grew up in the south but has lived in the north, is that, well, I think what used to happen was that change would begin, trends would be set, if you like, in places like London, perhaps to an extent also in places like Manchester, and other parts of the country would sort of catch up. So a change you might see in London, change in attitudes or behaviour that you might see in London would perhaps be followed up, as it were, in other parts of the country, in the north and elsewhere, perhaps 5-10 years later. I think that's much less true now. I think partly because of social media, partly because communication is so fast, partly because families are so scattered now over such large parts of the country, that social change, when it comes, tends to come more or less at the same time in right across the country. So I think possibly I mean, it's really only occurred to me just now for the first time. I'm just wondering if there is now perhaps a key social change in that what we used to see of sort of London, Manchester, perhaps one or two other cities as trendsetters, provinces kind of either catching up or just letting it pass them by. Maybe that's gone. And maybe there's now much more of a, I don't know, social change happens more quickly. Take young people, for example. You know, a trend which is underway in London will also be underway in Leeds, Manchester, or Halifax. Because you know, Leeds, which most of them have got. So I mean, I think that change is probably still working its way through.
How well do the growing communities of single culture integrate with neighbour communities of single culture? Is there a way of generalizing a comment over that?
If you take, for example, I mean, there are quite significant numbers of Jains, Hindus, and Sikhs living in places like, well, Huddersfield, Leeds, Manchester. You know, people go to the Hindu shrine, and yet they're integrated in the sense that, although it's a bit like Rishi Sunak, you know, the controversy over whether is he English or not. But, you know, I mean, the fact is that, you know, he blended into, you know, national life. He was a Hindu. He had a shrine of Ganesh. So it seems to cause some problems, but anyway, people are what they are. But so in that sense, there are communities which, you know, they rub along fine, and nobody bothers. There is a large Caribbean population in Huddersfield. In fact, where I first started teaching. For you know, and also in Leeds, North Leeds, quite a large Caribbean population. Certainly in the 1970s and 80s, there were issues. There were problems up to and including major, you know, disturbances at times, very problematic relations with the police and so on. Since that time, there's, you know, there've been issues from time to time, but there's been nothing much since, and people seem to rub along again, you know, tolerably well. With the Muslim community, it depends who you're talking about, really. There was a report years ago. There were very serious riots in Bradford, following, if memory serves, a National Front march or something of that ilk. And a report was produced which talked about parallel lives, in other words, you know, people living in very rigidly separate communities and not really communicating with each other. I think for quite a lot of people, to quite a large extent, that's still true. But there, you know, inevitably there is also crossover. You know, so our local pharmacy now is run by, you know, Muslim. I think they're a family actually, but anyway, but is owned by Muslims, run by Muslims. it's the community pharmacy, and that works fine.
Mm.
Our there's a local dentist. One partner is a Muslim, the other is a Sikh. So I would say it's mixed. Of course, Bradford was the site of the burning of the novel Satanic Verses by Salman Rushdie. What I would say, and in fact, Ed Hussein makes this point in his book Among the Mosques, which I strongly recommend, is that the picture is very mixed. That there are people who wish to follow a very clear, very militant agenda, which is partly what Nick Timothy was talking about in his response to the ritual prayer in Trafalgar Square. There are other people who simply wish to get on with their lives. Mm-hmm. So friends of ours who live in Halifax will tell you about their neighbours who are Ahmadiyya Muslims. Now, the Ahmadiyya Muslims, the Ahmadi Muslims, are a bit like the Quakers, very peaceable denomination within, well, I say within Islam. Not all Muslims recognise them as being Muslims, and there's an issue there. But all the way through to people who you'll find are, very, very militant, very militant, pursuing and really setting an agenda. So, for example, and I think this was covered on the national news, there's recently been guidance to schools on a number of issues to do with schools. And in relation to RE, one of the points made was that, and art, RE and art, was that doing figurative drawing might be offensive to followers of some faiths, Islam in particular. Mm. I don't know where that's come from. I mean, I've taught RE. From time to time, you get students to do artwork or something similar, and when you set a task, you take into account the fact that, for example, not everybody's very good at art. The fact that some people will have a problem with it and will wish to draw something abstract or representational. That's just a professional, sensible judgment that you can make. But it's the fact that they felt it necessary to issue a piece of guidance that made that point. Suggests to me that somebody's pushing an agenda.
Yes, I mean it's. I have an arithmetic theory that up to a certain level, I don't know what the key number is, but it's very simple. When you have a small incoming community of a certain size, it's reasonably easy for them to assimilate if they wish, or to be quiet and more inward looking if they prefer that. And for there to be little or no reason for friction because they just will presumably have a job to subsist. Well, one hopes. That's not always the case, I know, but in theory, that's the theory of it. And part of that goes back to colonial history. And I remember the example being made of the East India Company setting up in places like Madras and Calcutta. And in the early days, 18th and 19th century, at the early time of the building of trade that fostered the empire and gave us the jewel in the crown and all that, there weren't that many white-skinned people, and they befriended their business counterparts in those big cities. And so the relationship was purposeful and politically without problems. And then as trade grew, the numbers of white British who decided to go over and work and help expand the business at the other end and grow it as a trade, the numbers began, they got to a certain point where one passed that arithmetic level, whatever it is, and it becomes more inward looking. I find that sort of fascinating because it seems to be a universal law.
Yes, humans cluster.
Yeah.
Humans cluster. And I mean...
Is it tribal?
I'm not an exponent of ethnic determinism. the, um, the I mean, there is a tendency, isn't there? I mean, it's sometimes called ethno-nationalism to it. I don't quite know how far ethno-nationalists want to go with this. I suppose it depends on the ethno-nationalist, but there seems to be an assumption that if you have people of a particular ethnicity, however you define that, gathered together in one place in sufficient numbers, you will necessarily produce a particular kind of culture, which is to a large extent is probably true. But it's not possible to incorporate people who don't belong to that ethnicity, however that's defined. I mean, that's not my experience. I mean, there are, I've met plenty of people from lots of different backgrounds, are deeply, in the way they speak and the way they behave and their attitudes, that they fit in fine. I think partly it is exactly the point you were making, which is that, and in fact, Paul Collier, who's at Oxford University, makes the point that if immigration takes place quickly and in very big numbers, what you tend to get then is that the sending country reproduced within the host country. And in fact, there's a book, I think it's called The Culture Transplant, makes a similar point that if you import very large numbers of Chinese into a country, you'll tend to get a mini China, as it were, replicated in the areas where they settle.
That's not really a characteristic, as I understand it, of the British Empire, for example.
No,
we didn't go and multiply.
No,
in the way that is happening here.
no.
Now, some might argue that the fact it's happening here is probably a good thing because the host nation, the host peoples, are not reproducing at a rate that will replace their population.
This is where it becomes very, very difficult and potentially, inflammatory, is the view you take of the change that might come about. Whether you think that change is for good or else. I mean, all cultures change over time, which is another reason for questioning the idea of sort of ethnic determinism. The country we live in now, as we were discussing earlier, in all sorts of ways is very different, certainly from the one I grew up in. There are a number of key social and cultural issues on which attitudes have changed radically, just in my lifetime. So cultures do change, and cultures do also, I think, lose confidence in themselves.
That's certainly happening, isn't it?
Yes, and I think that's what's happened to the majority culture in this country. I think the issue is less with people coming in who may or may not be confident about their own culture. It is with the host culture, and I'm not entirely sure where it's come from, but we've been brought to a point where it's almost as if people have lost awareness that they too are members of a particular culture which has value. With the British Empire, the point about populations multiplying and so on, because places like Australia, Canada, New Zealand, it was a question of settlement, and the population multiplied. It depends. So in countries that are already very populated, like India and Africa and so on, no, the settlement tended to be quite small, certainly relative to the already established population. I suppose they viewed Australia, for example, as an empty space, which of course it wasn't altogether. yeah, so it's that difference, isn't it? And for a long time, Australia was very, but of course, interestingly, Australia, in terms of its uh, population makeup, attitudes towards migration, is going down a similar route to ourselves, as far as I can see. I might be wrong about that, but as far as I can see, they have got an immigration policy, but
Yeah. And countries like South Korea have a chronic, and Japan, I believe, have chronic
yes,
population replacement problems that they
mm,
aren't reproducing at a sufficient
no,
rate.
no.
And you wonder, I mean, do you have a spiritual, religious take on that in any way? Does it cause you to reflect on that dimension of life, moving through time and finding that there's an element of progress in the Western life and in the wealthier Far Eastern countries like South Korea and Japan as good examples? And then in tandem with that apparent sense of progress, but only on a material level, you've got the most basic of all issues, which is that the society is destined to fail
Mm.
by fault of number.
Well, we are.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah. On
But what do you make of that? Do you have a spiritual reading?
um, I was talking as a volunteer in the library of a local monastery, which has an Anglican college attached to it. And I was talking to one of the lecturers there, who's very interested in the whole phenomenon of secularization. Um, I mean, I think material prosperity has a lot to do with it. People come to take things for granted. Um, Life seems to be, um, I mean, in a prosperous society, if you are yourself prosperous, then life can be very pleasant, and not easy necessarily, but certainly, all your essential needs can be taken care of. I suppose the sense of urgency about having children, in case something bad happens, that goes. But it's almost as if um, the sense that we have that it's worth the effort, in not just in reproducing ourselves biologically, but also culturally, spiritually, and in other ways. It's almost as if the feeling that you take it for granted that that's what you do and that's worth. It's almost as if that's gone. And I think the decline of faith has quite a lot to do with it. There is quite a lot of evidence that um, a lot of more religious communities tend to have more children by and large, not monasteries obviously, but that Orthodox, ultra Orthodox Jews in particular, um, the Amish in the United States. It's that, I suppose it's that feeling of we're going forward into something which is transcendent and worthwhile and beyond ourselves.
Mm.
Which is a kind of spiritual feeling. If you like, it's a duty to continue and reproduce the race, or the nation or the society or whatever, um, in order to have something to hand on, and that what you have to hand on is worth it. So whether it's the old thing about the consumer society, it feels great on one level, but there's an emptiness at the heart of it, and the drink and be merry, for tomorrow we die kind of attitude. Is that the prevailing attitude, or is it simply the loss of confidence in ourselves as a culture and a civilization?
I remember when I
I
was a late teenager and aspiring to finding a partner for life, and looking at the question of raising children. And at that time, there had been some years of serious scares around the use of what were then referred to as atomic weapons, not nuclear weapons.
Yes.
And would you bring a child into that sort of world? And the ready answer was obviously a no. And it shooed you in straight away to what you were describing, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow, blah, blah. And that became the mantra for life almost.
Well, we have the climate crisis now, the so-called climate emergency. And I mean, there are people who are saying we're not having children because we're not going to bring them into a world in which they're likely to starve or fry to death. That kind of end time, in a way, it's that kind of end times thinking, which some of us are familiar with from some manifestations of Christianity. And Islam actually as well. That kind of end times thinking seems to have entered the secular world as well now, in the shape of the, as I say, the climate emergency and various other emergencies. So yes, I think that plays a part. I mean, there seem to me all sorts of symptoms around, I don't know, the quality of our national leadership, the design of buildings, all the art that we contemporary art, all sorts of signs that somehow we're no longer a culture that takes itself seriously. And if you don't take yourself seriously as a culture, why would you seek to reproduce it? Because I mean, having children, as much as anything, is about handing on an inheritance, obviously physical, monetary, but also cultural and historical.
Historical. I was just going to say, this is a segue into a discussion of history and the teaching of history, and in a sense, the besmirching of our national reputation, and thereby the idea of a culture that would be worth preserving. And it's a very dark downward spiral, that, isn't it? Because it just leads to an annihilation of what we thought was decent. British people were instinctively inclined to be compassionate and tolerate others, even if the reality of it was sometimes difficult, because it'd be a bit of a bump getting used to the Indian restaurant or the Asian corner shop, or but actually quite quickly that all assimilated. And I know I grew up having beer on a Friday night followed by a curry.
Yes, yeah, likewise.
That was an absolute ritual. I kept that going longer than I kept church going. So, and, like today, I've just been to a Pakistani dentist, and on Wednesday I go to a Chinese chiropractor, and that's life. The previous podcast was a British Nigerian, so the world is a great kind of brand tub, and it can be brilliant. All you've got to do is engage, I think.
Yes,
work at relationships.
It is important, but I think at the core of it, and all the elements are there for any people willing to. I mean, instead of vague mishmash about British values, really very little idea what they're supposed to mean, but that idea that there is this extraordinary culture which has emerged in Europe and of which we are a partial reflection. People can join that culture and contribute to it. Viktor Orban of Hungary did an interview with Miriam Cates on GB News, and it's available on YouTube, and it's very interesting because Miriam Cates asks him about his government's policy on immigration. And the question that Orban asks is, how do you sustain the freedom to disagree and debate and discuss within a context in which you have radically different outlooks radically different ways of life, all gathered together within one society, one country.
Yeah.
Um,
It's a huge
and
question.
it is a huge question, and implicit in that question is how do you agree on the means by which your disagreements can be resolved? You know, how do you agree on the standards by which disagreements, disputes, whatever, can be resolved?
Yeah, it kind of suggests that the globe is a certain size because it helps keep people who have terribly different approaches to life and existence,
Yes.
keep them apart.
Well, that's the argument for nation states, of course. That is the argument for nation states. You can have a, and but of course he's arguing in the sense that democracy, liberal democracy, requires a framework. Now, obviously, we're obviously I'm not for deportation of that. I just think that's a recipe for utter catastrophe. It's a horrendous thought, really. But we're not at the point where we can sort of go back to some kind of status quo ante. We can't do that. So somehow, and I think this is what Eric Kaufman talks about a lot. Somehow we have to find a way of, if you like, restoring enough of a commonly understood culture based on the traditions of this country that people can identify with it, see it as something of value, and work with it and work within it. And actually, this is part of the argument that Ed Hussein makes in Among the Mosques, and I mentioned that book before. Towards the end of his book, where he surveys what seems to me a pretty wide range, pretty full range of expressions of Islamic belief in this country. At the end of it, and this is an argument that doesn't just apply to Muslims by any means. He's saying he's talking about himself as a Muslim, but this can be applied to lots of other people too. We need to find a way of ensuring that the traditions, the beliefs that we bring with us can be molded into a form which makes it possible to live alongside and live within the traditions and customs already established in Britain by the British.
Mm. And that brings us around to self-confidence again.
Which brings us back to the whole issue of confidence, the teaching of history,
yeah,
the teaching of RE,
the direction of travel, this call it corruption, this capture of the institutions in Broad over the last 100 years by an ideology that is of a certain persuasion, definitely left of centre, and possibly more extreme socialism in mind. It's a turbulent world at the moment, an extremely turbulent world. And I wonder do you think it's the sense of turbulence that one might rightly feel? Do you think that's because the world of communications is so revved up now? And we all hear everything from anywhere at any time.
Yes, and yes, everything, everywhere, all at once.
Yeah,
that's the title of the film. I've not seen the film, but yes, I have that feeling increasingly, and very often people are responding without thinking through the depths of an issue as well. And yes, everything comes at us all at once, and it's very difficult to sort of decide, as it were, what to focus on, and what's important to think things through in depth. Yes, very definitely, and it's skimming the surface. I think that's part of it, isn't it? The constant need that people feel to sort of keep up with every latest twist and turn. Yeah.
With that terrible phrase that's been invented, you sit at your phone and the thumb flicks.
Oh, yes.
Doom scrolling. I think
yeah.
that could come out of J.K. Rowling, with Death Eaters and what have you.
Yeah.
Doom scrolling is sort of it.
No.
Once drawn into the negativity. But there we are. On a local basis, without a hierarchy of editorial supervision sitting over our heads, one can look at an issue and think, I don't know what the way forward is, but we're going to find it.
Yes.
Because, well, we need to. So let's do it.
Yes. I mean, the alternatives, don't bear thinking about. I mean, I think one of the things that we have to, one of the things that we have to do as a society, we've thought this for a long time, is to think things through in much more depth, but at the same time, really be much more serious than we're being about the implications of living in a society of such radical diversity as we now do.
Yeah, well, we're not really allowed to think about it because our elected representatives, or our elected not representatives, don't want the debate.
No, well, no, but the detail matters,
It sure does.
And context matters, and when you're, so I mean, if you take, there are all sorts of expressions of diversity which appear so on the surface. One act of worship is very much like another act of worship in the sense that they're both focused on God. They're both, exercising the freedom of worship, freedom of expression, and so on. So we've had the debate over the last few days, haven't we? So, why are you so concerned about the ritual prayer in Trafalgar Square the other week, but you're not concerned about the Palm Sunday procession in the same place? The issues are more complex than that, because yes, there are lots of iftars, breaking the meals, breaking the fast, and ritual prayers. But the issue is, who is doing this? Who is carrying out this particular ritual at this particular time, and what are their connections? What is their outlook in general? It's where the connections lie, what the agenda is behind each event, and we without being inflammatory. At the moment, the danger is that the most extreme forces on each side will, as it were, gain a hearing by default, and the danger is that unless there's a very serious and considered debate, then we're going to need, then they will simply win through. They will be the default voices.
Yeah, and I mean one of the voices that one's been hearing quite a bit is you're almost in the dark now, but we'll leave it.
I know. Is that better? Oh yeah. Suddenly.
One of the voices that we've heard of online in these long form conversational podcasts is Professor David Betts of, I think, UCL. So I think it's UCL, who's been predicting civil war, or the likelihood of civil war, he's saying, is being ramped up all the time. That's perhaps one needs to have these very sober warnings, but at the same time, do they encourage that sense of inevitability, that the inevitable continuance of breakdown, where loss of confidence migrates into something that becomes unruly in and of itself, because it's now there's the energies of the failing host society have lost touch with the systems and the value structures, the faith, we could argue, that had held it and encouraged its building, had rectified improper imbalances along the way. So, some people look back at the Industrial Revolution and say that created so much poverty. Well, actually, it created the opposite, because between 1800 and 2000, over those 200 years, that the eradication of poverty on a global scale was really quite extraordinary. Something like 70 to 75% eradication of global poverty as calibrated by statisticians. But, just that trend, upward trend, beneficial trend, is not really a taught thing as far as I can tell. Much as we aren't taught, certainly by our dear Church of England, we're not taught anything about all those who led the charge against slavery and brought about the acts, that abolished slavery, not just in the UK forbidding it, but across the empire.
Yes.
And the fact that the cost of all of that ran on for the best part of 200 years. And we only finally paid off the overheads for what was agreed in the early 19th century in 2015. So you and I, as taxpayers of a few decades, we've contributed to that action that was determined early in the 19th century to do away with slavery. And as far as I understand, there aren't many peoples and nations who have undertaken that. But it's not taught.
Our society, our history and culture do have ample resources for making the world a better place, as we've shown. And, there have been times when, of course, like any cultural civilization, we've done things that should not have been done. Put it mildly, slavery being an obvious example. But then again, as you rightly say, we did stamp it out. And I think with people like David Betts, and I don't know if he's come forward with any proposals for avoiding a civil war, but I think that's the vital thing. I think nothing's going to feed a sense of fatalism more than saying, well, if we continue like this, we're going to fall off a cliff. The question is, how do we avoid falling off the cliff? It's a challenge. It's a massive challenge. I think Orban is right. I think we've created a huge challenge for ourselves, not least because of the speed and scale with which our society has changed, especially the last 30 years. But it seems to be, first of all, we don't have a choice but to try and rise to the challenge, and secondly, it does seem to me that people on your podcast are a good example. There are enough people from different backgrounds who are sufficiently motivated and capable of rising to the challenge, and who understand the need to do so. But at its centre, it seems to me, does need to be this insistence on a core culture which is rooted in our traditions and our history.
Yeah.
And I think
one of the first people I spoke to was a man called Dave Walker, who was born and raised at the Elephant and Castle.
So it's mushroomed from her being a mediator to training a group of 10-year-olds in her school to be mediator, to bouncing on to possibly training a group, and they go like, we've got vocational courses, we've got like airy-ass bricklayers who, if they fall out of each other with a spade.
Oh yes,
classic South London working class area, and some of his really young mediators are at least as capable of brokering a better understanding of a conflict between two parties of whatever age than we would normally allow them the credit for. So Dave was able to work productively, creatively, and initially in a leadership role with these younger people. But he actually found that a 10-year-old was quite capable of sitting down with two warring parents, not from the same family, and find a way forward for everybody.
Certainly the last state school I taught in was in a very tough area. And there were children there, and I'm talking about the youngest, 11, 12-year-olds, year sevens, who would intervene in disputes between classmates. And you could tell these children had a lot of experience, and it's very sad in a way. You could tell, I'm thinking in particular one a couple of young 11, 12 years old who clearly had a lot of experience in mediating between warring parties,
right?
And were very, very good at it. They came from very difficult backgrounds, but very strong characters.
Yeah. So I mean, growth and beneficial change, both of those things are possible.
Yes.
And we have to work at that and keep the faith, don't we?
Yes, and
informing ourselves of our history and understanding the politics of the day better. I think there's possibly nothing more important, as I see it at the moment, that over the next 3 years, if it takes 3 years to get to a general election, we encourage those that we meet to pay attention to what's going on and get involved a bit in whatever small or large way they fancy that feels right for them. We're all at a different point on our journeys, and we just need to engage. And then whoever we end up voting for, which is very difficult to pick at the moment, left, right, or centre. I mean, I have no idea what I might vote next time round. We need to understand the issues better.
Yes,
sitting back and not voting is not a way of dealing with it, because I remember the old saying, if you don't vote, then you get the government you deserve.
Yes, well,
we're really in that sort of territory, I think.
Yes, I mean, I'm not in favour of compulsory voting, but I do think, I can understand people opting out. However, I do think, I think the issues are so clear cut at the moment. I mean, one thing I would say, in the sense it harks back to the thing about education earlier, we've reached a point where, and this applies to education, debate in public and so on, whereby the idea that somebody might be challenged on something they hold to be fundamental, they'll be, instead of being challenged, they're offended. And I think, someone would have found a way around that. The purpose of education sometimes is to challenge people. You're confronted with something that's outside your experience, outside your comfort zone, that's contrary to what you believe or you've been told to believe. But, it's in the nature of life that you will encounter things that do challenge what you think. I mean, we're handling diversity in the wrong way, almost with too much regard for people's alleged sensitivities.
Well, we can all be offended by anything at any point.
Well, yes. Yes.
How about growing up and getting over it? There we are, stroppy old guy. There's so much to talk about, and having a north-south divide, bridged over with what you see and what we kind of in London are experiencing, and sharing what clearly big issues that resonate in exactly the same way wherever we are, and that may also be true across Europe.
I would say London is well, partly because of its size, but it's much more of a patchwork here than here. By which I mean West Yorkshire, Calderdale. Leeds is not that big a city really, but Manchester would be more like London in terms of it being a patchwork of communities. Leeds to a certain extent. A place like Halifax, Huddersfield actually to an extent is, and again it's a town about the size of Halifax, but to an extent that's a patchwork. Now Halifax much less so. There you basically have two main communities. Bradford, it's I would think probably majority Muslim by now, but there are other communities. So the issues, it's not necessarily north-south. It might be urban, big city, small town.
Yeah.
Big city, small town, rural.
Well, London has even admitted to having grooming gangs now, so we're clearly not that different.
Yeah, we knew that up here already, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I think a lot of us in London knew it was true, but it wasn't admitted.
Because there were girls up here who had testified to being taken down to London.
Yeah, there you go.
Victims, victims of the gangs, been trafficked into London. Yeah, shocking.
It is. But on an uplifting note, you're a very busy man in community, and you obviously have a sense of purpose. You're a man of faith, and you're happy to talk about what you see and discuss it, and that is the very best way to share in conversation and maybe find the path ahead. It's not clear how we get down to the end of the road.
No.
But we can usually see maybe down here for a bit, see how that works. So we will meet again on one of these.
Very good. Oh, thank you.
Before not too long as well, because it's unfinished business, Charles. But thank you.
Yeah, oh, yes. Well, it will be for some time to come.
Yeah.